As soon as Berlin had surrendered to the Russians on the 2nd of May, von Krosigk had gone on the radio in Hamburg, and he used the phrase Iron Curtain that Churchill would later borrow for his anti-Russia Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. And the next day, the RAF had sunk the ships in Lübeck harbor, where most of the 10,000 inmates locked below decks had gone for days without food because there had been no food to give. The British had marched into Neuengamme concentration camp on the 2nd of May and reported that it was clean and empty, and that was because all the prisoners had either been moved to Bergen-Belsen or Osnabrück or had been put aboard the ships in Lübeck harbor. The police chief of the Hamburg Gestapo was George Henning Graf von Bassewitz-Behr, and he would claim that Himmler had ordered the ship scuttled with the prisoners on board, while some British historians placed blame squarely on the advance of the Red Army, saying that if it weren't for the Russians prevailing after Barbarossa, the Germans wouldn't have had to exterminate their camp inmates, and they argued that if only Hitler had beaten the Russians, the concentration camp prisoners would have been allowed to live. Neuengamme had been a sub-camp of Sachsenhausen, where over 10,000 Russian POWs had been shot in the back of the head through a secret hole while being measured for uniforms, and the Red Army had overrun Sachsenhausen on the 22nd of April, 2 days after the Germans had taken 33,000 inmates northwest on a death march, and many prison workers died on these forced marches, sometimes as high as 1/3 of them, but the German camp guards kept up the death marches because it gave them something to do other than having to report for duty at the Eastern Front. Monty had arranged significant press coverage for the signing ceremony in his tent at Lüneburg on the 3rd of May with his man von Friedeberg, but the German news broadcast called it a truce rather than a surrender, so Ike ordered Jodl and Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, Admiral von Friedeberg, to the city of Reims in France to sign a surrender that included making peace with the Russians. Monty's partial surrenders had not required that Germany stop fighting Russians, and Dönitz had been holding out, not just to give Germans more time to escape to the west, but to give the Russians more time to turn against the Americans, and Stalin had paused just 37 miles outside Berlin, not knowing whether or not it was a trap. But Stalin was certain that if Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov marched into Berlin and the British hollered about Russian aggression, there was a chance the Americans would go along with rearming the German army to fight against Russia, especially given Patton's public contempt for communism that was well known. If the Americans had sided with Britain's globalism against Russia's national communism, would the British get away with switching sides in the middle of a war again? The answer became clear when Ike ordered Patton to halt 50 miles west of Prague and issued stark orders that he was to allow the Russians to march in, and Ike ordered all allies in Prague to get out, gave Stalin the final go-ahead to take Berlin, and promised that the Americans would wait at Torgau, where they were already fraternizing with the Russians. Stalin ordered his final offensive on Prague on the 1st of May to begin on the 7th, and the day after Stalin's order went forth on the 1st of May, the new Chancellor of Germany went on the radio in Hamburg to warn about an Iron Curtain descending upon Europe. Stalin had done his best to carefully coordinate with the Americans, promising to begin his final offensive only after the Germans had surrendered to Ike on the 7th of May. But the citizens of Prague went ahead with an uprising on the 6th of May, that Sunday, that almost had the desired effect of getting Patton to march forward to fight the Russians. But Ike ordered Patton to stand down, and Patton obeyed, and General Jodl and Admiral von Friedeberg signed at Reims at Ike's headquarters on Monday morning. The Russians insisted on a signing ceremony the next day in Berlin because Dönitz had ordered all Germans to continue fighting Russians, still holding out hope that the British and the Americans would split and that the Germans could take up their arms again with their British comrades, steamrolling over the Americans and straight on to Moscow. But it was not to be. Himmler had been missing on the 6th of May, so just to be sure, Dönitz wrote a decree dismissing Himmler from any authority, and that had made it safe for the Germans to sign Eich's declaration of surrender to the last soldier on all fronts, including those fighting the Red Army, although the Germans on the British Channel Islands would hold out for another 8 days, because they'd lived there for 5 years and knew the Japanese were now making jet airplanes so they could beat the Americans. Accordingly, Eisenhower could not make any predictions. He entertained the theory that the Germans, as a last resort, might try to hold the Russians while letting the Allies through. He noted that the Germans, if they reasoned like human beings, quote, would realize the whole history of the United States and Great Britain is to be generous toward a defeated enemy, close quote, which was underscored by the fact that, unlike the Russians, the Allies observed the tenets of the Geneva Convention. And yet, the Germans in December had committed their reserves in Belgium, knowing the Russians were preparing the major attack in Poland, and so Eisenhower confessed he did not know, quote, who he, the German, considers his worst enemy in this war, close quote. Eisenhower at War, page 739. Himmler had been in Berlin on Hitler's birthday, and had been in Lübeck on the 23rd of April, and both Himmler and Speer had been at the Leichen sanatorium on the 24th that had to be abandoned by the 28th for the Russians to move in, and Leichen's Dr. Gebhardt would hang in 1948 at the same Landsberg prison where Hitler had been confined because Dr. Gebhardt had been found guilty at the doctor's trials for having done absurd medical experiments on prisoners in Auschwitz and Ravensbrück at the Leichen sanatorium. As the mood of disgust about the condition of the camps continued to grow day by day, Himmler then began pressing Baumbach, who'd been placed in charge of the government air squadron, to provide him with a plane so he could escape to Prague. Baumbach and I decided that we would land him on an airfield already held by the enemy, but Himmler's intelligence service was still functioning. "When people fly in your planes," he snarled at Baumbach, "they don't know where they're going to land." A few days later, as soon as communications with Field Marshal Montgomery had been established, Himmler gave Jodl a letter asking him to have it passed on to Montgomery. As General Kinzel, the liaison officer to the British forces, told me, Himmler asked for an interview with the British Field Marshal under a safe conduct, but this letter never arrived. Jodl destroyed it, as he told me in Nuremberg. Memoirs by Albert Speer, page 587. Among the American field commanders, sentiment for Berlin never strong did not last very long. Fear of running headlong into Russian forces was the major factor. Another was the unforeseen problem of pacifying the sectors already overrun in central Germany, routing food and medical care through a scene of destruction and ruin to millions of slave laborers and displaced persons, all the while administering distribution of bare subsistence rations to 40 million German civilians and Geneva-mandated rations to 2.5 million military prisoners amid the breakdown of German transport. Eisenhower at War, page 761. The 20th of July plot to kill Hitler in 1944 had been the last best chance to pull off a separate peace with Germany in Monty's Operation Goodwood, and American pilots had been told to go ahead and use their own initiative in July of 1944, rather than adhere to the strict bombing targets picked by the British. And in losing Goodwood, Monty had been forced to hand over control to the Americans on the September 1st deadline, and Ike had flown over to tell Bradley and Patton to follow orders only from Ike and to play along carefully with Monty until the British were no longer a threat to the Americans. Rommel had been strafed by an RAF pilot on the 17th of July, 3 days before the 20th of July assassination plot, and Monty had to abandon Goodwood on the 21st of July when the assassination of both Hitler and Rommel had failed. Chief Müller. If there were some kind of revolt, it was my duty to investigate it. Then about 1700, I got a call direct from Himmler, telling me that a certain colonel of the General Staff von Stauffenberg was to be taken into custody, if possible, from his office in the Bendlerstrasse and questioned about his knowledge of the bomb. Himmler told me that Hitler had been lightly wounded but was fully functioning, and that this matter had to be treated with absolute secrecy. He asked me if I had heard any news of this through the Gestapo offices, and I told him that I had not. He stressed repeatedly that I was only to observe matters and take no actions other than the apprehension of Stauffenberg. I must use the utmost discretion when bringing him to my office, and no one was to know who did not have to. Why one would be discreet about an assassin's arrest eluded me, and I asked Himmler directly. He became very annoyed, but almost immediately I had a call from Kaltenbrunner, who screamed that I was not to involve myself in this, and that General Juttner was in command of all armed SS units by direct order of Himmler. At this point, considering all the information pouring in, I became highly suspicious of Himmler's absence and his constant attempts to play this business down. The next thing I did was to go and see Schellenberg in his office. I wanted to know if his people had any information about foreign comment on the attempt. As soon as I walked in his office, I knew at once that there was some funny business afoot. Schellenberg was obviously very frightened. He was on the telephone and immediately hung it up when I came in. Don't forget, I am a trained police officer, and Schellenberg was only a cheap lawyer and a schemer and time server. He was sweating and pulling at his collar, so I asked what was going on. He was very nervous. He said he had no knowledge of any foreign information, but did say he'd heard directly from Himmler, who had ordered him not to involve himself in this. He suggested that this applied to me as well, and told me, with some false bravado, that everything was being taken care of at the highest levels. I replied with some force that on security matters I was the highest level. To get his reaction, I told him that I had personally alerted the Hitler bodyguard, and I told him that we were arming the building. At this he became really very frightened, and Schellenberg began twisting around in his chair and said that he did not know. But by now I was entirely suspicious of these creatures, and I gave orders that Schellenberg's telephone calls should be monitored at once. The man in charge of monitoring Schellenberg's telephone came and told me that he had overheard conversations between Himmler and Schellenberg that led him to think that Himmler was waiting to see what would happen. He mentioned the name Königgrätz to me and asked me if I knew what it meant. Aside from the battle in 1866, it meant nothing. He said Himmler had mentioned it several times, but obviously was being very careful what he said. Himmler apparently was frightened and told Schellenberg to keep as far away from me as he could and tell me nothing. Tell me what? I determined then to lay my hands on this snake and squeeze him, so I told him one of the armed SS officers in charge of the guard in the building to go at once and bring Schellenberg to my office. You should have seen that creature when he was brought in. He had experience in backstairs manipulating, but no experience in interrogation at all. I looked up and right in his eyes, I asked him to explain his part in the Königgrätz business, and at once all the fight went out of him. If he'd been frightened before, he was terrified now. I took my service pistol out. Then, of course, he went to pieces and began to weep. That's when I found out about the entire business. If Hitler were removed from office and Himmler put in place of him, a negotiated peace would follow. Himmler would be the head of state, and the SS permitted to remain intact as an internal police force. The army would join the Soviets in resisting any Western aggression in the Ruhr, and everyone would be happy. How any person with the slightest knowledge of Stalin could believe this great heap of shit is quite beyond me. He was now terrified that I would shoot him for treason, and he had no idea where he stood until I told him that before I take any further action in this case, I would first have to speak with Himmler in person. At first, Schellenberg denied knowing where Himmler was, but I soon convinced him to put through a call to Reichsscheine and have him come at once to the Prince Albert building. Himmler was obviously angry with me for interfering in his plans, but as always, he was polite and courteous in front of his staff. I told him quietly that I had very important information for him, matters of state. He hesitated and finally went into my office by himself. I had previously told the guard to keep everyone connected with Himmler out of the room. Schellenberg was locked in his office with no telephone. The guards in front of his door had orders to shoot him if he tried to escape. I pointed to a phone on my desk and told him that I'd just spoken with Hitler personally and was aware of what was in progress. At that, Himmler became very pale and said nothing. Once I had control of the situation, I began to interrogate him, but in a careful way, to be sure. He looked concerned and asked me very directly what I had uncovered. I only had to say Kerningratz, and he began to twitch in the face. "I have never heard the name before," he said. My response was to tell him that I had the entire story from Schellenberg less than an hour before. I reminded Himmler that I had once told him not to trust Schellenberg. He broke in to explain that of course he'd heard of plots to replace Hitler or to make peace with this side or that, but he had no sympathy with this sort of thing. He had naturally listened to what was said to learn what was going on. He had advised Hitler, he said very smugly, what was going on, and Hitler had approved his course of action. I then wanted to know why I, as head of internal counter-espionage and security, had not been informed about this. Himmler rolled his eyes and said that these things had best be kept very secret. I would have been notified when Himmler had all the evidence in hand. Yes, I told him, and now I had evidence from others which certainly was not favorable to a number of people in the SS leadership. You see, a number of senior SS officials decided that Germany was likely to lose the war. They had their own empire to think about, and eventually, about 1943, they decided that they would get rid of Hitler and put Himmler up as the head of state. They were connected, as I found out later, with all the small resistance groups, as well as with the enemy, both in the East and West. They could cover their tracks because they had the police power, and I must say with some embarrassment that I had no specific knowledge of this. I did, however, know about how they were going to finance their empire, even after the war. It was the Bernard operation. Q. Counterfeit money. Chief Mueller, exactly so. The faking of British and American currency had a double purpose. The first was to cause economic havoc with the economy of both countries, and to get funds to pay for intelligence operations, and put away something for themselves. I objected to it on these grounds. When I complained to Himmler earlier about the enrichment aspect of this, he told me to mind my own business. I wonder how much he had put away. Q. As much as you had? Chief Mueller. I'm sure not. He was basically very moralistic and would have been horrified at taking as much as I did. But then you see, I'm here and he's off in the woods somewhere. It's far better to be a live dog than a dead lion, don't you think? Gestapo Chief, page 164 through 70. Chief Mueller. Hitler always felt that the British were trying to assassinate him. Stauffenberg, through his wife's family, had British connections. The actual bombs and fuses were British in origin, but we later determined that they had not come from Abwehr, German Navy stores, and were not intended for use specifically against Hitler. Q. Now you see, you were accusing the OSS of doing this, Chief Mueller. A small joke. Q. How did the Abwehr get British explosives and fuses? Chief Mueller. The Abwehr had control of the entire SOE network in Holland, and the British dropped tons of weapons and sabotage equipment into the Abwehr's hands. there was a plot to seize Hitler using the Brandenburg Division, which had been plotted right down to the last detail, except, of course, they forgot to talk to the commanding officer or anyone on his staff. It came as a great shock to them later when the commander absolutely refuted their program and would not support them when he was interrogated. You have to understand, these idiots were arrested or detained and at once blabbed everything they knew to the Gestapo. I never had to mistreat anyone at all. It wasn't necessary. I personally ordered these men to have the July 20th prisoners executed at once. The major criminals had already paid the penalty for their deeds, but the Canarus gang remained. And there were also some still in jail in Berlin, awaiting trial or under sentence. As far as I was able to do so, I carried out Hitler's orders. Canarus and his gang were hanged at their prison and the others taken out and shot, some of them at the very last minutes before the Russians arrived to save them. I must tell you very clearly that I have no problem with carrying out that order, and if I have any regrets today, it is that I missed a few along the way. Gestapo Chief, page 152 through 68. FDR and Ike had strung the British along until the very end of Hitler's war, and the big problem had been keeping Russia from making a separate peace with Germany. And a large part of Churchill's problem with the Russians had been his abhorrence of their lack of polite manners cultivated by British upper classes. But FDR's reliance on working people for help with his physical disability had taught him the virtue and decency of the working class, and he needed to rely on help to get in and out of his wheelchair all day long. Keeping the Russians from making a separate peace became all the more difficult for FDR when Monty's demands for supplies to do his market garden had made FDR have to cut back on lend-lease to Russia by 40%. In March of 1944, everyone was asking the big question, why wasn't Stalin moving towards Berlin? On the 29th and 30th of September in 1941, over 33,000 Jew communists had been shot near Kiev at Babi Yar, and when Stalin heard that his faithful commissars were being buried in mass graves by Germans, the Russian counteroffensive had begun on the 5th of December in 1941, and 2 days later, Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese. For the foreseeable future, Stalin did not make war on Japan because he would need them as allies if the British succeeded on garnering a coalition to attack him and overthrow the motherland. Monty had been dragging his feet in the spring of 1944, waiting until the Russians charged towards Berlin, at which point Monty could seize the initiative to gallantly oppose them, liberating German POWs as he went and giving them the weapons and supplies that Monty had been carefully stashing away, all that endless lend-lease equipment he'd been demanding since D-Day. Some of those supplies could be sold to the Germans for cash, the market part, and some would simply be given away in the garden part. But for some reason the Russians had halted and would not move towards Berlin, and for Monty that was frustrating and maddening, and it would be discovered years later that Kim Philby and his friends had been apprising the Russians of all Monty's schemes in excruciating detail on a daily basis. In October of 1944, Churchill had gone to Moscow to ask Stalin to give up the southern Polish oil fields, and Stalin had just said no. And America had continued to side with the Russians and refused to accept Britain's accusations about Soviet imperialism because FDR saw British imperialism as far more dangerous. In July of 1945, a meeting was held in a suburb of Berlin called Potsdam at a former palace of the Kaiser, and Truman had been president for 90 days, and the main currency in Germany was Lucky Strike cigarettes, and 9 days into the Potsdam conference, Churchill excused himself to go home and lose an election. Throughout the war, the newspapers had been talking up German superiority, and To the world at large, news of the Russian victories overshadowed everything. In world capitals, Russian successes compared with the German triumphs of 1940 raised the questions, how do they do it? Observers noted that what made the Russians' success even more remarkable was the fact that the Germans had expected the attack in Poland and for weeks had published details of Russian concentrations and accurate forecasts of where the blows would fall. And yet within 72 hours the Russians had demolished German defenses on a 200-mile front and encircled Warsaw and Lodz, and in another 72 hours had advanced over 100 miles along the road to Berlin. The press groped for explanations. American Lend-Lease had equipped the Red Army with trucks and clothing. The Allied strategic bombing campaign that winter was a direct factor in the Russian successes, but the fact remained that the Red Army, written off in 1941 and 1942, had survived and gathered strength, contradicting those who as late as the fall of 1944 had predicted that the Russians would be too exhausted to overcome determined resistance beyond the pre-war frontier, and estimated 450 divisions advanced 300 miles through western Poland, Bulgaria, and western Romania, Budapest, and northern Yugoslavia, spreading destruction and terror on a vast front. The spectacle aroused misgivings about Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and even muffled pity for the Germans, but little could be done, and fatalism set in as word emerged of the German death camps uncovered by the Russians at Auschwitz and elsewhere, evidence of German crimes beyond imagination. The Red Army was bent on avenging 20 million Russian lives, and many quietly concluded that what the Russians did now was up to them. Eisenhower at War, page 677.